Humans are uniquely cooperative creatures. We build vast cities, global trade networks, and social safety nets. Yet, in the 20th century alone, our wars killed some 110 million people, enough to populate a massive nation of the dead. This capacity for extreme cruelty crosses every cultural and temporal boundary. We see it in the systematic murders carried out in Cambodia, Europe, and Rwanda. But we don't need to look at historic battlefields to see it. It happens in our homes and schools. Right now, up to 75% of adolescents experience cyberbullying, and physical bullying remains a daily reality in schools worldwide. To understand why we do this, social psychologists use a precise definition. Aggression is physical or verbal behavior intended to cause harm. This definition separates intentional injury from accidental collisions, or the high-energy drive of an assertive salesperson. That intention usually takes one of two forms. There is hostile aggression, which is an impulsive, explosive outburst driven by anger. Then there is instrumental aggression, where the harm is calculated, used as a tool to achieve another goal, like terrorism or organized crime. When horrific acts of intentional harm make the news, we often reflexively point to mental illness. However, the data shows that curing mental illness has a negligible impact on overall safety, only about 4%. The vast majority of perpetrators are sane. Their violence emerges from a complex, escalating equation. Our biology provides the baseline. There isn't a single violent center in the brain. Instead, we have the prefrontal cortex, which acts exactly like an emergency brake on our deeper aggressive impulses. Brain scans of violent individuals often show diminished activity in this exact area. The brakes are failing. Add to that our body's internal chemistry. High levels of testosterone, especially when combined with low self-control, significantly lower a person's threshold for hostile reactions when provoked. We'd even identified specific genetic markers, like the MAOA-L gene, sometimes called the warrior gene. Having it doesn't automatically make someone violent, but if a child with this gene suffers maltreatment, they become hyper-reactive to threats later in life. Genetics and brain chemistry merely load the weapon, leaving the individual highly vulnerable to the environment around them. The first environmental trigger is usually frustration, but it's not always caused by absolute poverty. Psychologists point to relative deprivation, the psychological friction you feel when comparing what you expect out of life with what you actually have. The wider that gap, the higher the tension. This intense frustration often zeroes in on specific targets. In 1989, a man walked into Montreal's École Polytechnique and murdered 14 women. He didn't know them. He harbored an intense, irrational frustration against women, blaming them for his own personal and professional failures. Sometimes, the spark isn't a complex psychological goal. Simple physical discomfort, like crowding, pain, or just being uncomfortably hot, acts as an immediate trigger for hostile aggression. This chart tracks Major League Baseball data. It reveals that when the ambient temperature on the field crosses 90 degrees, pitchers intentionally hit batters 50% more often than they do in cooler weather. But aversive sparks and intense frustration don't inevitably lead to physical attacks. They require a physiological state of arousal to push them over the edge. The human body struggles to distinguish between different types of excitement. If your heart is racing from a roller coaster ride or an intense run, your body is physically stirred up. If someone provokes you in that moment, your brain can easily misattribute that general physical arousal as intense anger. Once that anger is simmering, it looks for an outlet. That's where aggression cues come in. These are objects in our immediate environment that subconsciously signal our brains to release that pent-up hostility. The most potent of these cues is the weapons effect. Studies show simply having a gun visible in a room measurably increases a person's aggressive thoughts and willingness to deliver harsh punishments to others. The object itself physically amplifies the hostility. This effect scales up to entire nations. The United States has the highest number of firearms per capita in the world, and Americans are more than twice as likely as Canadians to use guns when they commit murder. The presence of the weapon facilitates the cruelty. Yet, even a biologically primed brain, sparked by frustration and accelerated by visual cues, still requires permission to act. And society provides that permission through social learning. In the 1960s, researcher Albert Bandura showed children an adult attacking an inflated Bobo doll. When those children were later frustrated and placed in a room with the same doll, they mimicked the violence perfectly. We learned that aggression works simply by watching others do it. Today, our media bombards us with these lessons. We watch highly attractive perpetrators commit justified, realistic violence that goes completely unpunished and rarely shows the true physical pain of the victims. This graph tracks data from a massive longitudinal study in New Zealand. It plots hours spent watching television in childhood against behavior at age 26. The data shows a clear upward trend. High exposure to television violence at a young age predicts higher rates of criminal convictions and antisocial personality traits in adulthood. This constant exposure writes social scripts directly into our brains. These are culturally provided mental instructions for how to act in a conflict. When challenged, we run a pre-programmed script that tells us to intimidate, dominate, or strike. A steady diet of media violence also creates a secondary effect: desensitization. After witnessing thousands of cruel acts on screen, regular viewers exhibit physically reduced empathy. In experiments, they even take measurably longer to help an injured person struggling right in front of them. Our surrounding culture completes the entire equation. It hands us a tactical instruction manual for how to hurt others, while providing the psychological numbing required to actually go through with it. So we arrive at the full picture: biological vulnerability plus intense frustration, multiplied by physiological arousal, triggered by environmental cues, and authorized by learned social scripts. This aggression equation functions as a fragile chain of events. Removing just one variable collapses the entire process. We have control over these intervention points. We can remove weapons cues from our immediate spaces. We can critically monitor the aggressive social scripts we consume. And we can learn to recognize when simple physical exhaustion or an elevated heart rate is hijacking our emotions. The human capacity for extraordinary cruelty is universal, but it is not a mystery. It is a process that we have mapped and measured, which means it is a process we can interrupt. By understanding the exact mechanics of how anger escalates into action, we reclaim our agency. We have the power to diffuse the violent impulses of humanity long before they ever ignite.